On the far side of the river, hidden behind shattered masonry and wet sandbags, a German officer kept his head low and his binoculars steady. Dawn had not fully lifted. The water still carried that gray light that makes everything look unfinished. Smoke drifted low across the banks. Somewhere farther back, artillery was still firing in uneven bursts. The officer had seen river crossings before. He knew what they looked like when men tried to force one under pressure. He knew the weak points. He knew the sequence. First came confusion, then bunching, then delay, then wrecked equipment near the shoreline, then men trapped in the open, trying to build something too exposed, too fragile, and too slow to survive. What he was watching did not fit any of that. The Americans were already at the edge of the river. Trucks were backing in, turning out, moving with a speed that looked less like improvisation than rehearsal. Boats touched the water. Sections of bridge decking came forward. Engineers ran, crouched, lifted, locked, shouted, waved, and kept moving. Nothing looked elegant, nothing looked ceremonial, but everything looked practiced. The first shapes in the water did not seem important by themselves. They were only parts. Floating bodies, narrow surfaces, men bent over metal. But then the officer saw the pattern. The parts were linking. The line was extending. The thing was taking form faster than his mind wanted to accept. This was supposed to be the vulnerable moment. If you like serious Second World War history told with the pressure, detail, and human weight it deserves, subscribe now, because this story only grows stranger from here. The officer lowered the binoculars for a second, then raised them again, as if a second look might restore the old logic. A bridge under fire should hesitate. It should become a bottleneck. It should collect damage faster than progress. Shells should break rhythm. Machine gun bursts should force men flat. Smoke should blind officers trying to control the work. Vehicles should jam the approach roads. Orders should lag. A crossing site should feel like a wound opening wider and wider until the whole attempt stalled in front of the water. Instead, the Americans behaved as though the river were only another problem already measured and assigned. He saw one team working the bank, another guiding craft, another bringing forward sections. He saw traffic being controlled behind them with a harsh efficiency that German officers usually associated with the best engineered operations, not with a force already pushing hard and advancing deep. He saw men exposed on the water, and still the line kept growing. A shell landed near the far bank and threw up spray. A few heads turned. Nobody ran backward. Nobody scattered in panic. The movement dipped, adjusted, then continued. The bridge was not finished. That was the alarming part. It was still in the stage where it should have been easiest to break. It was still becoming. And yet even in that unfinished state, it already seemed to possess momentum. The officer had the uneasy sense that he was not watching construction. He was watching accumulation. Every minute gave the Americans more structure, more reach, more stability, more options. Every minute the task became less stoppable than it had been the minute before. Delay, which should have favored the defender, was favoring the men in the water. That was not supposed to happen. German officers had been taught to think of rivers as truth-tellers. A river stripped armies down to essentials. You could not argue with current width bank conditions. Approach roads, vehicle weight or exposure, bold plans that worked on paper often died beside rivers. Bridging was engineering, yes, but it was also timing, concealment, control, and nerve. A crossing tested command discipline because it compressed everything into one narrow place. Men, machines, fuel, ammunition, wounded, orders, traffic, artillery support, anti-aircraft cover, all of it had to pass through a point that the enemy could see and target. Bridges created possibility, but they also created vulnerability. That was why destroying them mattered so much. A broken bridge was not only ruined equipment, it was halted movement, it was trapped weight, it was a timetable collapsing into mud and smoke. And yet, by late 1944 and into 1945, more and more German officers were staring at American bridging operations and reaching a grim conclusion. They could hit them. They could damage them. They could force local pauses. But stopping them in the decisive sense, stopping them long enough to change the battle, stopping them hard enough to prevent the crossing from becoming a road for the whole army, that was becoming another matter. The officer by the river knew he should think in technical terms: range, rate of fire, crossing width, flow rate, assembly sequence, best target points. But another thought had already entered his mind, and once it entered, it would not leave. He was not facing an isolated bridge crew. He was facing a force that had made bridge building part of a larger machine. The men in front of him were only the visible edge. He watched a truck reverse into place with the confidence of a driver who had done this before. Not once or twice, many times. Another vehicle moved away the moment it had unloaded. Men carrying equipment did not appear to need long explanation. They moved toward tasks that seemed already understood. Officers signaled, but the operation did not depend on constant reinvention from above. It moved with a brutal kind of familiarity. The officer had seen well-led units before. This felt different. This felt industrial. A burst of fire struck close enough to throw up another dirty wall of water. The officer waited for the rhythm to break. It did not. Some men ducked. Some shifted position. A few seconds vanished. Then the pattern resumed. That, more than the speed, disturbed him. Not that they could work quickly, but that disruption itself did not appear to reset the work. The Americans absorbed interruption and kept building. The crossing did not depend on one perfect, uninterrupted stream of motion. It tolerated friction. It had enough men, enough material, enough practiced sequence that local damage did not turn into total paralysis. He had seen operations fail for less. The Germans had their own fine engineers. They were not fools, and they were not naive about bridging. They understood pontoon work, assault crossings, ferries, road discipline, the cruel arithmetic of riverbanks under observation. But what they were seeing from the Americans was not simply good engineering in the old sense. It was engineering tied to mass, traffic control, standardized equipment, rehearsed procedure, and a command culture that treated crossing not as a rare technical miracle, but as an expected phase of movement. The difference mattered. A force that sees bridging as an exceptional act behaves one way. A force that sees it as routine behaves another. The first protects the crossing like a delicate operation. The second drives through it with a frightening appetite. The officer looked up the river and down it, searching for the usual signs that might still restore confidence. Congestion, hesitation, exposed reserve vehicles waiting too long, officers over-signaling because events were slipping away from them, men clustering near the launch site with no room to move. He found some of these in fragments. No operation was smooth everywhere, but he did not find enough of them. The Americans were not perfect. They were worse than perfect. They were resilient. That is the kind of thing armies fear most. A perfect system collapses when you crack it. A resilient one absorbs the crack and keeps functioning. German officers had spent years learning to exploit moments of confusion, strike the crossing site, hit the roads feeding it, break the timing, force delay, create enough pressure that a local disruption becomes an operational failure. That logic remained sound against ordinary river work. But what if the crossing force had more bridging gear than expected? More trained crews than expected? Better traffic discipline than expected? Better artillery support than expected? Better air cover at the crucial hour? Better road transport bringing replacement sections forward? Better command confidence that another bridge could go up even if this one took damage? What then? Then each act of destruction bought less. And that was the nightmare taking shape on the river. Not that the Americans could not be hurt. They could. Not that bridges could not be broken. They could. But each broken span, each damaged float, each shelled bank, each burst of delay no longer carried the same reward. The defender's effort and the attacker's setback were drifting out of proportion. German officers were spending precious shells, precious time, precious remaining control, and often buying only minutes. Sometimes not even that. The officer put his binoculars down once more. He could hear engines through the artillery. That too was wrong in a way that touched something deeper than tactics. Engines meant flow. Flow meant the crossing site was not isolated. It was linked to roads behind it, to fuel, to depots, to command posts, to whole columns still coming forward. The bridge was visible, yes, but its real strength was offstage, stretching west beyond the banks, beyond the woods, beyond whatever the officer could see from his position. He raised the binoculars again. The bridge had grown while he was thinking. That was another detail German observers began to remark upon in one form or another. American bridging seemed to advance inside the time it took the defender to process it. A man could identify the threat and still feel late. He could see the crossing site, call for fire, and yet by the time the fire landed, the geometry had changed. More sections had gone in, more men had reached the far bank, more support weapons had crossed, more smoke had risen, more traffic control had been imposed on the approaches. Each minute the Americans were no longer trying to establish a bridgehead, they were thickening it. That thickening mattered more than civilians often imagine when they think about war as maps and arrows. A thin foothold is a possibility, a thick foothold is an event. Once enough men, equipment, anti-tank guns, vehicles, ammunition, and communications exist on the far side, the crossing stops being a gamble and starts being a fact. At that point the question changes. It is no longer whether the enemy will cross. It is how far he will drive once he has. German officers knew this. That was why they feared these moments. A failed crossing leaves wreckage. A successful one opens a door through which an entire operational disaster can enter. And by this stage of the war, when German forces were already under pressure from the air, under strain on fuel, under stress in command, under constant demand to improvise with shrinking reserves, the idea of American engineers creating doors faster than they could be closed carried a terrible weight. Rivers had once been natural pauses. They were becoming temporary inconveniences. The officer beside the river was not looking at all of that in grand phrases. Men under pressure rarely do. He was seeing it as fragments, another truck, another section in the water, another burst of shell fire that solved nothing, another set of figures moving on the bank with the hard confidence of people who have rehearsed the sequence until it lives in their muscles. But from those fragments a judgment was forming. And that judgment would spread across German reporting, memory, and post-war testimony in different shapes but with the same core idea. American bridge building was not frightening because bridges were indestructible. It was frightening because the whole process around them had become too fast, too well supplied, too repeatable and too hard to disrupt at the decisive point. He was watching a technical act become an operational certainty. Look closely at that phrase, because it gets to the heart of the matter. Armies do not win crossings because a few brave engineers worked heroically in the water. Courage matters, and these men had it in abundance. But courage by itself cannot explain what so many German officers found so disturbing. What disturbed them was that American bravery was attached to systems. The men had the nerve to work under fire. They also had the equipment, transport, doctrine, protection, support, and replacement flow to make that nerve count. Without those things, bravery becomes sacrifice. With them, bravery becomes throughput. That is an ugly word for war, but it belongs here. Throughput. How much can move? How fast can it move? How quickly can interruption be overcome? How steadily can the crossing site turn effort into usable combat power on the far bank? In battle after battle, this was the hidden American gift. Not elegance, not theatrical genius. Conversion. Materials into movement, training into speed, speed into pressure, pressure into collapse. A bridge is only wood, steel, pontoons, decking, cable, anchors, ramps, and labor. Yet when German officers talked about these crossings as if they were something beyond simple destruction, what they were really describing was the frightening efficiency with which the Americans converted all of those separate items into immediate battlefield consequence. Another shell struck, another plume rose, another few seconds vanished. The officer waited for the operation to fail in the old way. It did not. The men on the water were not alone now. He could see more activity on the approaches, support weapons being guided, More vehicles waiting under control rather than bunching in disorder. Engineers on the bank, moving with the confidence of workers who knew the order of tasks and did not need to invent them under stress. This is one of those details that sounds dry until you picture what it means. A river crossing under fire is noise, mud, urgency, fear, shouted corrections, split-second judgment, and constant temptation to panic. In such a place, every task that has already been decided in training is one less task that must be decided in chaos. Every standard piece of equipment is one less puzzle. Every practiced hand signal is one less shouted sentence drowned by engines and shell bursts. Every established sequence is stolen time. The Americans had stolen a great deal of time. German doctrine deeply respected the value of preparation. In many areas of war, German officers had every reason to trust their own standards. But by the last year of the war, especially against the Western Allies, they were confronting an enemy that could marry preparation to abundance. That combination is deadly. Preparation alone can still be worn down. Abundance alone can still become clumsy. But the two together create something much harder to stop. Enough trained men, enough bridging equipment, enough trucks, enough fuel, enough radios, enough artillery, enough road control, enough replacement parts, enough command confidence to commit the crossing without treating it as a once-in-a-campaign event. That is when a bridge begins to feel less like a structure and more like an incoming tide. And tide is the word we should keep near us as this story unfolds. Because the officer by the river was learning in the most immediate way possible that what he faced could not be understood only by looking at the bridge itself. A tide is not one wave, it is a force created by larger things beyond the shoreline. The American bridge was like that. Shell one section, another came. Delay one team, another took over. Damage the bank, engineers reworked the approach. Threaten one crossing point, others could emerge. The visible structure mattered, but the real menace was the depth behind it. At some point, the officer understood that his binoculars were lying to him, not because they showed false images, but because they framed too little. They showed the men in the water. They did not show the training camps, the depots, the factories, the road networks, the standardized bridging parks, the traffic regulations, the transport columns, the command habits, and the industrial assumptions that made those men what they were at that moment. To the eye, it was a bridge. In truth, it was a civilization arriving at the river in mechanical form. That sounds grand. War often forces grand truths through ordinary objects. A truck axle, a fuel can, a radio battery, a bridging pin, a length of treadway, a crane boom, a practiced corporal waving a driver into place. Empires show themselves through such details. German officers looking at American crossings were not only seeing skill, they were seeing national capacity condensed into one tactical act. And once they started seeing that, the old comfort of destroy the bridge and stop the crossing became much less comforting. Because what if the bridge could be replaced? What if the crossing could continue through ferries while repairs happened? What if multiple bridges could go up? What if traffic could be redistributed? What if the attacker had enough engineer units that losing one rhythm did not end the music? Then the defender was no longer trying to break a bridge. He was trying to outmatch a system in motion. The officer kept watching. He had no luxury of philosophical distance. He was there to observe, to judge, to report, perhaps to direct fire if he could, perhaps to pass on what he saw to men farther back, still trying to decide where resistance mattered most. Yet even in those practical duties, a darker realization began to settle. A river crossing is supposed to give the defender a chance to punish the attacker at his most exposed point. If even here the Americans could create momentum faster than it could be denied, then where exactly would the pause come? At what line would movement finally slow enough to be managed? At what obstacle would pressure stop turning into breakthrough? That question hung over many German decisions in the late war, whether stated openly or felt in silence. Defensive war becomes far more frightening when obstacles stop behaving like obstacles and begin behaving like delays. The bridge in front of him was not complete yet. That mattered. We should hold on to that image. Not the finished span carrying columns at full flow, but the unfinished one already exerting pressure, already altering calculation, already forcing the defender to think not about whether he could stop it, but whether he could stop it in time. Those are different thoughts. The first belongs to confidence. The second belongs to retreat. He watched the line push farther into the water. He watched men commit themselves to the exposed work as if they trusted the process more than the danger. He watched the shells land and fail to produce the kind of paralysis that defenders depend on. And as the light rose over the river and made the whole ugly scene clearer, he began to understand that the Americans had done something larger than bridge building. They had changed the cost of interruption. That is why this story matters. Not because it gives us another heroic scene, though it does. Not because it lets us admire engineers, though they earned that admiration 1,000 times over. It matters because in moments like this, German officers were confronting a truth that reached beyond one river. They were discovering that American war-making had become extraordinarily good at turning vulnerable moments into temporary phases. The crossing was still dangerous, men still died, equipment was still wrecked. Nothing about this was easy, but the point at which danger used to become stoppage was moving away from them. And once an enemy starts moving that line, the war begins to feel different. For now, though, all of that larger meaning still rested in one immediate picture. A hidden observer, a cold river, shells striking water, engineers in motion, trucks feeding the bank, and a bridge that seemed to grow inside the defender's own disbelief. The officer could report on the sections, the pace, the fire, the visible support. He could estimate progress. He could mark the site. But underneath the technical language, another message was taking shape. The Americans were not merely building across the river. They were building through the defender's assumptions. And that is where the real story begins. Because the fear German officers expressed did not come from ignorance. It came from a depth of experience. They knew exactly what should have broken a crossing like this. The disturbing fact was that the old logic was still there. And yet somehow it was no longer enough. German officers were not shocked by American bridge building because they lacked engineering sense. They were shocked because they had too much of it. They knew what river crossings cost. They knew how many things had to go right, how many things could go wrong, and how quickly one broken sequence could ruin the whole attempt. That is why the scene on the riverbank felt so disturbing. It was not simply that the Americans were efficient. It was that they were doing something that should have been vulnerable in a way that no longer behaved like a vulnerable thing. To understand why that mattered, we have to leave the river for a moment and step inside the military logic German officers had been trained to trust. A bridge in war is never just a bridge. It is weight, timing, exposure, traffic, and prediction. A river crossing compresses an army's movement into a narrow problem. That narrowness is everything. On open ground, a force can spread out. It can mask weakness with width. It can route around damage, disperse vehicles, reduce the effect of a single well-placed strike. A river strips away that freedom. Banks funnel men and machines toward limited sites. Current, slope, depth, and soil decide what equipment can be used and where. A crossing point becomes a temporary throat through which everything must pass. Troops, engineers, ammunition, guns, fuel, radios, vehicles, medical evacuation, reserve formations, command traffic. All of it converges toward one zone that the enemy understands as both necessity and weakness. That was why defenders loved rivers, not because they made attack impossible, but because they made attack legible. If the attacker wants a cross, he must reveal himself in sequence. First, reconnaissance, then assembly, then boats or ferries or assault elements, then engineers, then support weapons, then traffic control, then the first heavy movement. With enough observation, enough fire discipline, and enough timing, a defender can break that sequence at the moment when interruption hurts most. He does not need to destroy the entire enemy army. He only needs to turn compression into paralysis, delay the crossing long enough and the attacker loses surprise. Damage the approaches badly enough, and the bridge becomes unusable, even if it stands. Hit the site at the critical moment, and men and vehicles pile into one another, schedules collapse, and the river does the rest. This was not abstract theory. German officers had lived inside such thinking for years. The German army came out of a military culture that respected movement, initiative, and local decision-making, but also took physical constraints with great seriousness. A river was not a line on a map. It was a practical test of whether plans could survive contact with terrain. German engineers understood pontoon bridges, ferries, assault boats, and the exacting demands of getting heavy weapons over water before the enemy recovered. They understood that crossings required more than courage. They required order, assembly, under concealment, movement, discipline on the roads, timing between artillery support and engineer work. Anti-aircraft protection if hostile aircraft were active, careful control of what crossed first and what waited. A bridge was valuable, but that value was double-edged. The moment it existed, it became indispensable. And the moment it became indispensable, it became the obvious target. This is the piece civilians often miss when they imagine wartime bridging as a dramatic technical feat. The real danger begins not when the bridge is impossible to build, but when it becomes too necessary to lose. If the crossing is the only way to sustain the attack, then the defender no longer sees the bridge as mere equipment. He sees it as the hinge of the whole operation. Destroy the hinge, and the door never opens. German officers trusted that logic because history had rewarded it again and again. Even in the age of engines and aircraft, rivers remained places where old truths survived. Wide water slowed armor. Mud ruined schedules. Banks trapped trucks. Engineers, no matter how brave, could not summon decking and anchor points out of air. Bridges required material. Material required transport. Transport required roads. Roads required regulation. And regulation could be broken by fire, wreckage, panic, or simple overload. War had always been full of plans that depended on one narrow place remaining calm under impossible pressure. Rivers were where those plans most often died. So when German officers said American bridge building felt impossible to stop, the word impossible carried a special bitterness. It did not mean they literally believed no bridge could ever be damaged or destroyed. They were too practical for that. What they meant was more painful. They meant that the usual logic for making a crossing fail was producing smaller and smaller rewards. To feel that properly, you have to understand the assumptions the defender brought to the river. First, he expected congestion. This expectation was not foolish. Congestion is the natural disease of war. Too many vehicles, too many priorities, too much urgency arriving on too little road. A crossing point makes this worse, because the attacker must move different kinds of units in the right order under stress. Engineers need room to work. Infantry need room to form and move. Artillery wants position. Trucks want access. Tanks want their turn. Commanders want updates. Medical traffic wants passage. A single stalled vehicle near the bank can block everything behind it. One overturned trailer, one panicked driver, one misrouted convoy, one section delivered to the wrong place, one jammed turn in the dark, and the road feeding the crossing site becomes a knot. Under fire, knots become disasters. German officers expected to see those knots. Sometimes they did, but increasingly, against the Americans, the knot did not tighten enough. Second, the defender expected exposure to dominate. A bridge under construction is naked by its nature. Men work on open banks. Boats move across visible water. Sections float before they lock together. Vehicles waiting near the site reveal lines of approach. Smoke, engine noise, and traffic patterns betray intent. Even without perfect observation, a defender can usually guess where the crossing will come if he studies the ground and thinks like the enemy. Once the site is identified, the task is simple in concept, if not in execution. Make exposed work impossible. Keep men flat. Smash the approaches. Damage partially assembled sections before they become useful. Punish every minute the engineers remain in the open. That is what should have happened. Third, the defender expected interruption to cascade. This was one of the central truths of river warfare. A crossing under construction is not a stable machine. It is a sequence. Sequences are fragile, because each stage depends on the one before it. Delay the first wave, and the engineers arrive under worse conditions. Damage the first bridge sections, and the second wave cannot move on time. Break traffic discipline behind the bank, and the men who need material do not receive it when they need it. Interruptions should not remain local. They should spread. One shell lands in the wrong place at the right time, and a 5-minute disruption becomes a 1-hour delay. A 1-hour delay becomes daylight exposure. Daylight exposure becomes heavier fire, heavier observation, more wreckage, more confusion, more dead, more hesitation. Soon the entire crossing is no longer a controlled offensive act. It is a battered attempt to rescue the operation from its own timetable. German officers believed in cascades because cascades had always been real. Fourth, they expected logistics to turn against the attacker. This was especially important. The farther an army advances, the more its own success becomes a burden. Bridges do not exist in isolation. Once the first men cross, the attacker must feed the far bank. He must move anti-tank guns, machine gun ammunition, mortars, radios, medical support, engineers, command vehicles, and eventually heavy equipment. A thin crossing can be brave. A thick crossing must be sustained. That means fuel, traffic discipline, replacement parts, repair capacity, and a steady flow of everything the bridge itself consumes or enables. The defender's hope is that the river becomes a point where the attacker's appetite outruns his ability to feed it. German officers had reason to believe this would happen to anyone. They also knew that good bridge building was not enough by itself. One could imagine excellent engineers building a technically sound bridge and still seeing the operation fail because the roads behind them clogged, because heavy weapons arrived too late, because the far bank could not be reinforced in time, because artillery support faltered, because anti-aircraft cover proved thin, because command lost track of which units had crossed and which had not. Crossing a river is not simply putting structure over water. It is keeping an entire combined arms movement coherent during one of its most dangerous transitions. That is why the American performance struck German observers so hard. It appeared to violate not one expectation, but many at once. The Americans did not eliminate congestion, but they often managed it well enough that congestion failed to become decisive. They did not eliminate exposure, but they compensated for it with speed, support, and repeated action. They did not avoid interruption, but interruption no longer guaranteed cascade. They did not escape the burden of logistics. They seemed to bring logistics with them in such volume that the burden itself became part of the strength. Those last words are worth holding for a moment, because they describe the deeper strategic shock behind these river scenes. German officers were used to thinking of logistics as limitation. And in truth, logistics is limitation. It tells an army how far it can go, how fast, with how much, and for how long. But in American hands, logistics increasingly appeared not merely as a limit, but as a weapon. The more trucks, fuel, spare parts, bridging stores, engineer battalions, standardized vehicles, road discipline, and recovery equipment the Americans had, the more every interruption lost sharpness. The huge apparatus behind the crossing did not remove danger. It blunted the defender's ability to turn danger into stoppage. That was a terrible thing to face as the defender. Imagine being the German officer responsible for this river sector. You know the crossing points that make sense. You know the roads likely to feed them. You know that if the enemy gets serious weight over the water, the line behind you may have to bend. You know you do not have shells to waste. You know local reserves are limited, fuel is tighter than it should be, communications are under strain, aircraft support cannot be assumed, and the wider front is already cracking in places. Under those conditions, the river is one of the few remaining pieces of terrain that still promises real defensive value. It offers you a chance to hurt the enemy at the moment of maximum compression. And then the Americans arrive and treat the crossing like a hard but manageable phase. That is when the river stops feeling like a shield and starts feeling like borrowed time. German doctrine, especially at its best, was built around making tactical moments matter. A local delay could create operational breathing room. A sharp blow at the right point could restore order far beyond the immediate battlefield. That habit of thought was rational, but it depended on a world in which the enemy was vulnerable to local dislocation. What if the enemy had enough depth to make local dislocation recoverable? What if his engineering units were not rare specialists whose loss crippled the operation, but numerous, well-equipped teams supported by more material than the defender could easily imagine? What if his traffic control was good enough that vehicles did not simply pile into wreckage and die there? What if his higher command expected river crossings and had already resourced them accordingly? What if he had the power to suppress defending guns even when he could not eliminate them? What if he could put up multiple crossing solutions at once, forcing the defender to divide his attention? Then the river was still dangerous, but it no longer offered the kind of clean veto defenders crave. All of this becomes clearer if we think in terms of time. A defender at a river is not really trying to destroy a bridge for the sake of destruction. He is trying to buy time in chunks large enough to matter. 10 minutes can be useful. An hour can be serious. Half a day may change the entire operation. A full day might allow reserves to arrive, positions to be reorganized, command decisions to be revised, or withdrawal routes to be managed with less chaos. Time is the real currency at the crossing. Artillery, machine guns, mortars, demolitions, anti-tank obstacles, and local counterattacks are all tools for buying it. German officers increasingly found that American bridge building made time expensive. You could spend shells and buy minutes. You could expose guns and buy minutes. You could order local resistance that consumed men you could not afford to lose and buy minutes. Sometimes you bought an hour. But too often, by the time the bridge was sufficiently delayed, the Americans had already created enough foothold on the far bank to make the delay less meaningful. The crossing, even when damaged, retained momentum. And momentum in war is often more powerful than perfection. An imperfect bridge that exists in time is worth more than a perfect bridge that comes too late. That was another old rule being turned against the defender. German officers also expected the attacking engineers to feel singularly exposed. This matters because psychology governs labor under fire. River work is exhausting, even in peace. In war, it becomes a test of nerve and routine under noise, spray, smoke, cold, and the constant knowledge that the enemy can see the water. Men tasked with lifting sections, guiding pontoons, anchoring lines, and locking components together are not protected by heroic mythology in the moment. They are protected by sequence, trust, discipline, and the sense that the system around them is functioning. If they begin to feel abandoned, singled out, or cut off from support, speed dies. What German officers saw in American bridging operations suggested the opposite sensation. The engineers did not seem isolated. They seemed embedded. They worked as though artillery, transport, traffic control, command, and replacement material all belonged to the same conversation. That impression alone matters. A man is steadier under fire if he believes the road behind him is alive and competent. One of the deepest differences between a fragile army and a resilient one is how many of its men can work under pressure without waiting for perfect instructions. Fragile armies often contain brave individuals, but their systems require too much freshness from command. At the very moment command is most overloaded, resilient armies push clarity downward. Tasks are pre-understood. Procedures are standardized. Material fits expectations. Drivers know their lane. Engineers know their order. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers can keep motion alive when shells, smoke, or broken communications blur the top of the chain. German officers were used to admiring this kind of competence in themselves. Watching it in American engineer work, backed by American abundance, was another reason the scene bit so deeply. The bridge should have broken, because crossings always depend on more things than can be perfectly protected. That was the theory. But the Americans brought something dangerous to the theory: margin. Margin is not glamorous. It is spare fuel, spare bridge sections, spare transport, spare crews, spare radios, spare routes, spare recovery capacity, spare command confidence. It is the ability to lose one piece and continue Because the system was never built on a razor's edge. German forces in the later war lived with shrinking margin. Their success often depended on precision, because precision was what remained when abundance had faded. The Americans could combine competence with margin. That changed the shape of failure. A precision-based crossing can be elegant, but if it loses a key piece, it stumbles badly. A margin-based crossing can look rougher, heavier, more mechanical, and still keep going after damage. This is one reason German observers sometimes described American military methods with a mixture of respect and frustration. They did not always look refined in the old European sense. They looked big, organized, rough at the edges, and frighteningly difficult to exhaust. A bridge built by such a system did not need to be beautiful. It needed to work soon enough, long enough, and repeatedly enough that the attack on the far bank thickened faster than the defense could master it. Now bring this back to the defensive side. What would you do, standing in German boots at that river? Do you fire first at the engineers on the bank? Do you strike the floating sections before they lock? Do you target the approach roads? Do you save shells for when heavier vehicles begin to cross? Do you commit local infantry to the bank? Do you wait for the bridge to become more valuable before you spend scarce fire? Every answer carries risk. Fire too early, and you may reveal positions without decisive effect. Fire too late, and the crossing hardens. Hit the bridge itself, and traffic may shift to ferries or alternate sites. Hit the roads, and engineers may still complete the span. Try to counterattack locally, and you may feed men into artillery and machine gun fire, supporting the crossing. This is the defender's torment. The river seems like a simple problem from far away. Up close it becomes a timing contest against an enemy who may have more depth than you can see. German officers had been trained to master such contests, but by the later years of the war, especially against the Western Allies, the wider military environment was turning against them. Allied air pressure complicated movement by day. Fuel shortages narrowed options. Communications suffered from strain and disruption. Replacement quality varied. Artillery was not always available in the weight or concentration desired. The local commander at the river might understand perfectly what should be done and still lack the means to do it at the right scale. That matters because when German officers called American bridge building impossible to stop, they were sometimes describing not only the attacker's strength, but also the shrinking room in which the defender could operate. Still, that alone is not enough to explain the tone of their reaction. Plenty of strong enemies can be delayed. Plenty of well-supported attackers can still blunder. The American difference lay in the combination: engineer skill, standardized bridging gear, truck mobility, practiced control, strong artillery, broad logistical depth, and the command assumption that crossings were not extraordinary events, but expected tasks. Piece by piece, these factors chipped away at the defender's confidence that rivers would behave the way rivers were supposed to behave. Let us stay with the German expectation of bottlenecks a little longer, because it reveals the structure of the shock more clearly than any single dramatic anecdote. A bottleneck is useful to the defender because it creates predictability. If the attacker can only move a certain amount of men and material across at a certain speed, then the defender can model his fire, his reserves, and his local counteractions accordingly. A bridge under construction should be the purest bottleneck of all, yet American bridge building often shifted rapidly from bottleneck to conduit. Even before the crossing was fully mature, it threatened to become something the defender could not efficiently regulate through fire alone. A conduit is much worse than a bottleneck, because once enough flow begins, every additional minute of survival multiplies effect on the far bank. German officers were not blind to this multiplication. They understood that the first wave across was not the whole danger. The first wave buys the second. The second protects the engineers. The engineers enable support weapons. Support weapons secure the bank. Secure banks allow heavier flow. Heavier flow builds a bridgehead. A bridgehead allows armor, artillery, and supply to operate beyond the river. Soon, the crossing is no longer merely a tactical event. It becomes the opening act of a larger unraveling. That is why the bridge should have broken. Not because engineering made no difference, but because too much depended on it succeeding. The defender's hope was always that such dependency could be turned into weakness. German officers kept waiting for the dependency to bite. Instead, they were watching the Americans make dependency survivable. This is one of the great hidden themes of industrial war. The most powerful systems are not those that avoid dependency. They are those that can carry dependency without collapse. An advancing army is always dependent on roads, bridges, fuel, maintenance, timing, and command coherence. There is no escaping that. The real question is whether the system behind those dependencies is thin or deep. German officers at Rivers were beginning to understand that the American system was very deep indeed. And the deeper the system, the more discouraging the immediate tactical picture became. A shell landing on a bridge section might once have promised decisive reward. Now it sometimes promised only more work for men who had more material coming behind them. A damaged approach ramp might once have created hours of confusion. Now it might create a short pause while traffic was rerouted or repairs began. Fire that once could have made a crossing impossible now often made it merely harder. Harder is not nothing in war. But harder is not the same as denied. This psychological shift matters as much as the material one. Defenders fight differently when they believe local resistance can still produce meaningful delay. They fight with sharper commitment because the obstacle in front of them still feels like a lever. Once that confidence erodes, the same obstacle begins to feel temporary. Men still resist, but resistance loses a certain inner conviction. The river is still fought over, yet it no longer feels like the place where the enemy will be truly halted. It feels like one more line he will push through at cost. German officers were disciplined enough not to surrender to despair as a doctrine, but they were also experienced enough to recognize when an old form of confidence was fading. The crossings haunted them because they exposed something broader. The Americans were not simply better at bridge building than expected. They were better at turning bridge building into a continuation of movement. In earlier military imagination, a river crossing often stood apart from the advance. It was a pause, a crisis, a special effort, a dangerous hinge. In American practice, it increasingly looked like a hard but incorporated phase of the same larger momentum already rolling eastward. That is a profound difference. The more a crossing is treated as a special, isolated gamble, the easier it is for the defender to load all his hopes onto breaking it. The more a crossing is treated as one robust element in a moving system, the harder it becomes for the defender to find the decisive cut. No German officer watching such work needed a lecture in industrial theory to feel this. He felt it in the ugly details: trucks arriving when they should, sections present in sufficient number, engineers who did not seem surprised by the procedure, supporting fire that kept enough pressure on defending positions, traffic control that stopped the approaches from degenerating into madness, bridges, ferries, and alternate means treated as related tools rather than singular miracles. Above all, he felt it in the reduction of payoff. Spend effort, buy less delay. Spend more effort, still not enough delay. Repeat until the crossing thickens beyond your power to reverse. There is a cruel simplicity to that realization. War does not require every old rule to disappear. It only requires them to lose enough sharpness at the wrong moment. The German logic of rivers remained true in principle. Crossings were vulnerable. Bridges were essential. Traffic could choke. Men in water could die quickly. None of that vanished. What changed was the relationship between truth and effect. American methods did not abolish the vulnerabilities. They exploited enough strength around them that the vulnerabilities stopped behaving in the old decisive way. That is why the bridge should have broken, and did not. By now, we can see the shape of the problem from the German side. Rivers were supposed to compress an attacker into a punishable form. Bridge sites were supposed to concentrate confusion. Damage was supposed to cascade. Logistics were supposed to tighten the noose around the crossing rather than loosen it. Exposure was supposed to multiply defensive value. Yet with the Americans, each of these expectations kept producing outcomes that fell short of the defender's need. The crossings still bled. They still consumed material and nerve. But they too often came through. And once they came through, the consequences ran far beyond the waterline. Because a successful crossing does not merely place men on the far bank, it proves something to both sides. To the attacker, it proves that momentum survives danger. To the defender, it proves that one of the best natural opportunities for interruption has failed to interrupt enough. That emotional difference matters. Armies are not machines, even when they are supported by vast machinery. They carry judgments inside them. A crossing that succeeds under pressure tells the attackers that their system works. The same crossing tells the defenders that their chosen moment of resistance is less powerful than they hoped. The German officer at the river in our opening scene did not need to think all this in formal language. He only needed to watch the bridge refuse to become the kind of disaster he had been taught to expect. But behind that immediate picture stood the whole doctrinal weight we have now traced. Rivers, bottlenecks, exposure, traffic, cascades, the value of time, the cost of delay. The necessity of decisive interruption, the terrible defensive hope that one narrow place can still punish a stronger enemy enough to matter. That was the hope the Americans were steadily hollowing out. The crossing should have broken because war had always taught that crossings break, men bunch, roads clog, sections go missing, fire lands at the wrong moment, officers lose the sequence. Material burns beside the bank, the attempt falters, the river reasserts itself. That was the old lesson. The new lesson, the one German officers were learning with growing bitterness, was that the bridge itself was only the visible expression of something much larger. The reason it did not break, in the old way, was not hidden inside the water. It was hidden behind the water, in the roads, depots, training grounds, engineer battalions, traffic systems, standardized gear, and command habits that fed the site with such relentless competence. In other words, the problem was no longer the crossing alone. The problem was everything that arrived with it. The deepest mistake a German officer could make at the river was to look only at the river. That sounds simple, but it cuts to the center of the story. By the late war, more and more German observers were discovering that what made American bridge building so hard to stop was not the bridge by itself, not the pontoon sections, not the engineers standing in cold water, not even the speed of assembly, though that speed mattered. The real force lay in everything standing behind the bridge, feeding it, protecting it, replacing it, and turning it from a vulnerable construction project into an extension of the entire American way of war. That larger logic fits the blueprint you uploaded almost perfectly. The visible scene is only the surface expression of a much deeper mechanism. German officers were trained to think in concrete military terms. Where is the crossing point? What units are involved? How many bridging elements are visible? How long until the first vehicles pass? What is the width of the river? How good are the roads behind the banks? How vulnerable is the work to artillery? Can air attack reach the site? Can reserves counterattack before the far bank thickens? These were proper questions, necessary questions. But against the Americans, those questions began to produce answers that felt less and less satisfying because the obvious target was no longer the real center of gravity. The bridge could be seen. The system behind it could not. That difference changed everything. A German officer with binoculars might watch American engineers drive forward treadway sections, launch pontoons, guide boats, fix ramps, manage approach roads, and begin pushing a usable crossing into existence under fire. He might correctly identify every technical stage. He might even know precisely when the site was most vulnerable. But what he could not fully see from the riverbank was the depth of preparation that made those visible stages so hard to interrupt decisively. He could not see the engineer battalions already trained to repeat the sequence. He could not see the standardization that let parts fit expectations rather than surprise the men handling them. He could not see the transport system pushing material forward with mechanical discipline. He could not see the maintenance network keeping vehicles alive long enough to matter. He could not see the fuel organization, the depot flow, the road regulation, the replacement stock, the command habits, and the industrial assumptions that made damage survivable. He was seeing the tip of a machine. American engineers did not operate like isolated technical specialists summoned for rare miracles. That is one of the most important truths in this story. In many armies, bridging had an aura of exception. It was something highly skilled men did at very dangerous moments, often under desperate pressure, with the entire operation hanging on their performance. The Americans still depended on skill and courage, of course, but by the later war, American bridge building had begun to look less like an exceptional stunt and more like the expected labor of a force that had prepared itself to cross obstacle after obstacle without treating each one as a crisis of civilization. That shift is hard to overstate. When an army treats a bridge as a miracle, the whole operation grows brittle. Every delay feels dangerous. Every hit feels catastrophic. Every missing part becomes a crisis. Every mistake carries the emotional weight of singular failure. But when an army treats bridging as one recurring phase in a larger flow of movement, the psychology changes. Men still feel fear. They still die. They still work under shell fire and machine gun bursts. Yet the task itself belongs to a system already built to absorb strain. That was what the Germans were running into. The Americans were not simply putting men at the river. They were putting procedure there. They were putting rehearsed sequence there. They were putting standardized material there. They were putting transport there in such quantity and order that the crossing site could be replenished rather than merely prayed over. They were putting command assumptions there that said, in effect, yes, this is dangerous. Yes, this is exposed. Yes, parts will be damaged and men will be hit. Continue the process. That last point matters enormously. Great military systems are often defined less by what they avoid than by what they expect. The Americans expected friction. They expected damage. They expected mistakes, mud, current, fire, congestion, and loss. But instead of organizing their crossing plans around the fantasy of uninterrupted perfection, they organized them around continuation. That is the heart of the system. Not the elimination of problems, but the reduction of their stopping power. German officers could feel the effect of that, even when they could not fully describe it in doctrinal language. They saw shellfire land and fail to produce decisive paralysis. They saw damaged work resumed. They saw traffic corrected rather than simply ruined. They saw engineers behave as though interruption belonged inside the procedure, not outside it. They saw, in short, a crossing force that had margin. 3 Haid verse towns. Margin is a quiet word, but it belongs beside every dramatic word in war. More sections than the bare minimum. More transport capacity than a fragile timetable should allow. More trained men than one hit can erase. More roads feeding the operation. More engineer resources. More recovery tools. More command confidence. More artillery support. More ability to reassign, replace, repair, and continue. A system with margin behaves differently under stress than one living on a knife edge. German formations by the later war were increasingly short on margin. Even when they still contained intelligence, professionalism, courage, and local tactical skill, they often lacked reserves in the deepest sense of the word. Reserve fuel, reserve vehicles, reserve communication strength, reserve bridging stock, reserve artillery freedom, reserve time. When margin shrinks, precision becomes everything. The operation must go right because there is too little depth to survive much going wrong. That makes a force sharper in some moments, but also more fragile in others. The Americans, by contrast, could combine competence with depth. This is where many German officers began to experience the American method as something almost unfair in its accumulation of advantages. A bridge under construction is not strong because it is technically impressive. It is strong because it belongs to a command and supply structure willing and able to keep feeding it through trouble. That means drivers arriving when needed, traffic police keeping movement from choking, engineers who already know the sequence, officers who do not need to invent the procedure from nothing, artillery that suppresses enough enemy fire to preserve momentum, and logistics officers who understand that the crossing is not a side issue. It is the artery through which the next phase of the campaign will live or die. The Germans, of all people, understood what it meant when an army's higher structure truly supported a tactical act. They had built victories on that kind of integration themselves in earlier years. That is another reason the American crossings bit so deeply. German officers could recognize real system strength when they saw it. They knew the difference between brave local improvisation and an operation backed by national capacity all the way to the riverbank. What they were seeing at American crossings was national capacity turned into timing. That phrase deserves to sit with us. Factories are meaningless to the man in a shell hole, unless what they produce arrives at the right time, in the right form. Depots are meaningless unless roads feed the front. Standardization is meaningless unless stressed men can rely on it when the moment comes. Training is meaningless unless it lives in muscle memory under fire. The American achievement was not abundance by itself. Plenty of states have possessed large quantities of materiel and still failed to turn it into battlefield coherence. The American achievement, at least in this domain, was the conversion of abundance into process. And process is what defenders hate most when it works. A dramatic enemy can be understood, a brilliant enemy can be admired, but a procedural enemy, one who keeps turning resources into action with relentless steadiness, becomes exhausting to fight. You damage one part and another appears. You delay a task and the sequence resumes. You hit the crossing site and traffic keeps feeding it. The operation is not dependent on one inspired moment. It is dependent on repeated, competent ones. That makes it far harder to kill with a single blow. This is also why American bridge building looked so different from what German officers expected when they thought about exposed technical work. Traditionally, the crossing site should have been a place where tension magnified every weakness. The Americans instead made it a place where organization multiplied every strength. The river remained dangerous, but danger no longer dictated tempo by itself. Tempo began to come from the attacker. That is a frightening transition for any defender. Think about what it means on the ground. A German artillery officer receives the river report. Bridging work underway. Enemy engineer. Movement visible. Support. Activity. Growing on the approaches. He prepares to act. In older terms, this should be the point where fire buys real operational time. But against the Americans, even well-placed fire too often found itself attacking not a brittle event, but a supported mechanism. One team is slowed, another continues. One section is damaged, replacement appears. One lane clogs, regulation restores flow. One site is struck, ferries or alternate methods preserve movement while repairs proceed. The American crossing becomes a family of solutions rather than a single exposed gamble. That is the real significance of system thinking in war. It produces substitution. Substitution is devastating to the defender because it weakens the value of his best hit. If the enemy depends on one exact method, then breaking that method may break the entire operation. But if the enemy can substitute, repair, reroute, or reinforce quickly, then every local success shrinks in consequence. The Germans were not only watching bridges go up, they were watching the reward structure of defense deteriorate. Another element made the American system especially dangerous: repetition. American forces had crossed many rivers. They had trained for this work. They had institutional memory. They had doctrine. They had engineering resources distributed through a larger army that expected movement, expected obstacle reduction, expected hard transitions, and expected that such transitions could be managed with the correct mixture of manpower, material, and sequence. Repetition matters because it transforms fear. Men are still afraid, but they are less surprised by the order of events. They know where to stand, what to lift, when to move, how to signal, which unit follows which, how the approaches should look, how the bridge sections are handled, what the first heavy movement requires, how traffic is regulated, and what happens when the site takes fire. That knowledge is priceless. At a riverbank under artillery, the enemy is trying to do more than destroy equipment. He is trying to disrupt mental order. He wants confusion to spread faster than control. The American answer to that was not mystical courage. It was prepared familiarity. They had seen versions of the problem before. Their engineer units and supporting structures were built so that many necessary decisions had already been made long before the first shell landed. This gave the Americans something the Germans increasingly lacked by 1945, the power to remain procedural inside chaos. That may sound abstract. It is not. It means drivers still unload in something like the right place. Engineers still complete tasks in something like the right order. Traffic officers still impose some discipline. Commanders still understand the crossing as a managed effort rather than a dissolving crisis. Guns still support. material still arrives, repairs still begin. The crossing site does not become calm, but it also does not become mentally ungovernable. German officers observing this were not looking at magic. They were looking at organized national wealth translated into tactical stamina. And yet wealth alone would not have been enough. We need to be careful here. It is tempting to tell this story as though the Americans simply solved every problem by having more. That would be too lazy, and it would miss why German professionals found the phenomenon so alarming. Plenty of rich armies can waste resources. Plenty of powerful states can drown their own front lines in excess without producing clarity. The American edge at these crossings was not only mass, it was mass married to standardization and command habit. The parts generally fit the system generally fit the doctrine generally fit the expectation of continued movement. That is what made the whole machine so hard to choke. A bridge is not merely a thing over water. It is a promise about what will come after the water. German officers understood that immediately. A bridge that carries only a few men is dangerous. A bridge that begins carrying the full weight of an army is decisive. The Americans were good at turning the first into the second quickly. That quickness did not come only from the engineers. It came from road discipline behind them, from vehicle supply, from command timing, from artillery coordination, from transport abundance, from recovery capacity, from signal discipline, and from the wider cultural habit of treating logistics not as an embarrassing support service, but as a central condition of victory. That last point separates armies more than most battlefield myths admit. Some military cultures admire the spear and neglect the hand that keeps passing it forward. Others come to respect the hand as much as the spear. The Americans, whatever their flaws, had built an army in which engineering and logistics were not ornamental. They were integral to movement. This mattered at the river more than perhaps anywhere else. The crossing site exposed the truth of a military system because it forced every hidden function into one narrow test. Supply, transport, engineering, traffic control, command trust, artillery timing, repair capacity, route organization, and morale all met at the waterline. German officers watching American crossings were seeing those hidden functions pass the test again and again. And that is what made the bridge feel unstoppable. Not invulnerable, not immune, unstoppable in the harsher operational sense. The defender could still break pieces of it, but he could not stop the larger transformation it represented. The Americans were taking a dangerous local act and integrating it into a massive moving architecture. The bridge was the visible symptom. The system was the disease. Let us take one more step into the American method itself. American engineering in the European War benefited from more than courage and equipment. It benefited from a culture of practical simplification. Standard load classes, standard bridging components, standard procedures, standard recovery logic, standard traffic management habits, standard command expectations about what engineer units were there to do. War is complicated, but successful armies survive by making repeatable parts of it less complicated where they can. Every reduction in unnecessary variation saves thought under pressure. Every saved thought saves seconds. Every saved second at a river can become a span, a lane, a crossing of guns, a reinforcement of the far bank, a repair before dawn turns into full day. The German officer at the river may not have known the bureaucratic depth behind those simplifications, but he could feel their result. American work often had a blunt directness to it. The crossing did not look precious. It looked driven. Men arrived, tasks linked, roads fed the bank, parts came forward, support built around the operation, and movement resumed. There was nothing theatrical in it. That was precisely the point. A system that performs under stress without needing theater is a mature system. Another hidden strength of the American approach was its ability to think in parallel. German officers, facing a crossing site, naturally thought in the sequence of exposure and disruption. The Americans, by contrast, increasingly behaved as though several solutions could coexist. Engineers build, ferries move while bridges form. Traffic is regulated while artillery supports. Repairs begin while forward elements still hold the far bank. Alternate sites remain possible. Reserve materials remain in motion. The crossing is not one narrow thread but multiple threads twisted together. Cut one, and the rope still holds. This parallelism crushed the defensive fantasy of decisive interruption. A defender longs for the moment when one hit changes everything. American systems were designed, insofar as any wartime system can be designed, to make one hit change less than expected. This is why so many German officers felt as though they were fighting the wrong object. They aimed at the bridge because the bridge was in view. But the bridge only worked because a much larger arrangement had already solved problems the defender hoped to create. In that sense, American bridge building was a lesson in modern operational warfare. The battlefield object that matters most may not be the one with the greatest physical presence. The real strength may lie in the invisible regularity behind it. A span across water is dramatic. A traffic plan is not. Yet the traffic plan may decide whether the span becomes useful in 10 minutes or 50. A shell burst looks dramatic. A replacement section stacked 3 roads back does not. Yet the replacement section may quietly erase the shell's meaning. Heroism is visible. Prepared depth often is not. German officers were learning to fear the invisible part. And that fear reached beyond the crossing site itself. Once they understood that the Americans were not improvising these operations but reproducing them, the psychological effect deepened. One bridge could be seen as an unfortunate local success. Repeated bridge building under pressure became evidence of a wider truth. The enemy had found a way to make one of war's most vulnerable moments less decisive than it should have been. That is not merely a tactical irritation, it is a strategic warning. Because once the river ceases to impose real operational pause, the advance on the far side accelerates in a new way. Armor flows sooner, supply follows sooner, artillery support thickens sooner. Command confidence grows sooner, defensive reorganization receives less time, withdrawal becomes harsher, what was supposed to be a line becomes a phase, the whole defensive timetable begins to collapse inward. That is exactly why the American system mattered more than the bridge. The bridge was never the final objective, it was the conversion point. It converted industrial capacity into movement, movement into bridgehead, bridgehead into penetration, and penetration into the erosion of the defender's entire local position. German officers understood conversion very well. They had once been masters of operational exploitation themselves. Seeing it performed against them, with such material depth behind it, carried an almost professional cruelty. If you had asked one of those officers what frightened him most at the crossing, he might have named the shell-resistant rhythm of the engineers, or the speed of assembly, or the number of trucks, or the way damage seemed never to mature into paralysis. All of those would have been true, but beneath them sat the larger answer. The Americans were no longer treating the river as a singular military drama. They were treating it as a managed logistical and engineering transition inside an advance they fully intended to continue. That is why the old defensive logic kept failing to deliver the reward it promised. The bridge did not stand alone. It was connected backward into depots, factories, training schools, manuals, road discipline, standardized machinery, engineer doctrine, command assumptions, and a nation whose style of war increasingly depended on turning support functions into engines of tempo. The hidden strength of American bridge building was not that it denied vulnerability. It was that it surrounded vulnerability with enough organized power that vulnerability stopped being terminal. That is the kind of thing professional soldiers notice first and resent longest. It meant the Germans were no longer confronting a crossing site in the old sense. They were confronting an entire operational civilization narrowed into one practical act: men working in mud, vehicles feeding the bank, sections locking in place, support gathering around the growing line, fire landing and failing to matter enough. A bridge emerging under pressure, not because rivers had become easier, but because the army at the river had become far harder to interrupt than the one defending it. And once that truth became clear, the site itself changed. The Germans were no longer watching men put structure over water. They were watching momentum acquire a road. Once German officers grasped that the Americans were bringing a system to the river and not merely a bridge, another question forced itself forward. If the crossing could not be prevented in the old clean way, could it at least be broken after it began? Could artillery, air attack, sabotage, or local counterblows damage it enough, often enough, that the whole operation would still fail on the far bank? That question was not theoretical. It was fought over with shells, smoke, engineers' bodies in cold water, broken sections, wrecked vehicles on approach roads, and commanders trying to buy time they no longer seemed able to afford. The answer the Germans kept discovering was harsh. They could hit the crossing. They could damage the bridge. They could kill the men working on it. They could force pauses. They could even destroy spans. But too often, the Americans repaired, substituted, reinforced, or simply thickened the bridgehead fast enough that the local tactical success lost operational meaning. This is where the phrase "impossible to stop" began to harden into something more than frustration. It became a judgment formed from repeated experience. The defenders were not blind. They did what defenders are supposed to do. They fired artillery at the riverbanks and the bridging sites. They tried to hit the approaches where traffic compressed before entering the crossing. They attacked the floating sections before they became a complete and useful span. They tried to disrupt the engineering rhythm at the moment when men were most exposed and the structure least stable. Where aircraft could still reach, they attacked from the air. Where local reserves existed, they tried to contest the far bank before the crossing matured into something heavier and more dangerous. All of that made sense. All of it could work under the right conditions. But by the later war, especially against American forces, the Germans kept running into the same bitter result. Good blows often landed too late to matter fully, or landed in the right place but bought too little time, or bought enough time locally but not enough to change the larger movement already forming around the site. That distinction between local and operational success is the heart of this section. A bridge can be damaged and still have succeeded in the larger sense. A crossing can be bloodied and still have broken the line. A site can be under fire and still have already delivered enough men, guns, engineers, and communications equipment to make the far bank hold. This is one of the cruel lessons of modern war. Tactical destruction does not automatically produce operational consequence. The Germans knew that in principle. Against the Americans at Rivers, they were forced to feel it in the ugliest practical way. Consider the defensive dream for a moment. An enemy comes to the river. He begins the crossing under pressure. You identify the site. You bring fire onto it. The engineers take losses. Equipment is hit. Traffic on the approaches snarls. The bridge is damaged or delayed. The far bank receives too little support too late. Your local reserves counterattack. The crossing fails. The attacker must regroup, shift sites, consume more material, lose momentum, and surrender the timetable that made the whole effort dangerous. That is how the scene is supposed to work when the defender's system still has enough bite. Now imagine the more American version the Germans increasingly encountered. The site is identified. Fire comes in. Men are killed or shaken. Some sections are damaged. There is confusion on the bank. And yet the engineers keep working because they expected interruption. Traffic stumbles, but regulation and volume prevent total seizure. Ferries, boats, or alternate crossing arrangements still move essential support while repairs proceed. The far bank, though still thin, receives enough reinforcement to avoid immediate collapse. Supporting artillery continues suppressing defending positions. Engineers start mending damaged sections almost as fast as the defender can celebrate the hit. Another bridge site may begin elsewhere, or enough material waits behind the river to renew the attempt without a long strategic pause. The Germans have hurt the crossing, but they have not stopped the growth of the bridgehead. That is a terrible thing to realize in the middle of battle. Let us stay with artillery first, because it was the most direct and most common instrument. Artillery is the classic answer to river crossings. Water, bank transitions, approach roads, assembly points, and partially completed structures all invite fire. The geometry seems ideal. A defender does not need to eliminate every engineer. He needs to land enough shells at enough critical moments to break sequence, create wreckage, force men flat, and lengthen the crossing's most dangerous phase. Under ordinary conditions, this should work beautifully if ammunition, observation, and communications hold. But American crossing operations steadily blunted the decisive value of artillery fire in several ways. First, speed reduced the window of pure vulnerability. The faster bridging components could be brought forward, assembled, anchored, and turned into something usable, the less time the defender had to exploit the crossing at its most fragile stage. A delay of 15 minutes might still be meaningful. A delay of 2 minutes was not the same thing. And that was part of the German problem. Even when artillery disrupted the work, the Americans often restored motion before interruption ripened into real paralysis. Second, depth in material and personnel made damage less final. A bridge section hit by shell fire could be replaced. Men lost on the bank, terrible as that was, did not automatically end the operation if the system had enough trained hands behind them. Damage that would cripple a thinner operation became survivable in a deeper one. German officers were trained to think in terms of multiplying effect from a timely blow. Against American engineer resources, the multiplication often flattened. Third, supporting American firepower made German gunnery itself harder to sustain. A crossing site rarely existed alone. It was usually supported by artillery, smoke, and wider combined arms effort, intended to suppress or at least complicate the defender's ability to keep effective fire on the site. German batteries could still shoot, of course, but maintaining accurate, repeated, and well-observed fire against an enemy also capable of returning enormous volume was another matter. A defender's gunners might land a punishing salvo and then find themselves under intense counterfire, forced to displace, reduce activity, or fire with poorer observation. Again, the point is not that American support was perfect. It was that it was strong enough, often enough, to shrink the defender's payoff. Now think about air attack. In theory, aircraft should be ideal against river crossings. Bridges are visible. Traffic compresses. Smoke and water create recognizable patterns. A timely attack can damage not only the span, but also the roads, waiting vehicles, and engineering work clustered at the approaches. German officers had every reason to imagine aircraft as one more hammer for smashing a vulnerable crossing phase. Earlier in the war, many armies had feared precisely this kind of thing. But by the later war, the wider air situation had shifted brutally against Germany. Allied air superiority did not mean every German aircraft vanished from the sky, but it meant that German air attack could no longer be treated as a steady, reliable answer to every critical battlefield problem. Fuel shortages, pilot attrition, production pressures, maintenance strain, and the larger collapse of the Luftwaffe's position all narrowed what could realistically be done. Even when aircraft did strike, they were entering a battlefield environment increasingly shaped by Allied anti-aircraft defenses, fighter presence, and the wider difficulty of coordinating effective concentrated attack at precisely the moment required. This matters because defenders do not win on possibilities. They win on timely execution. A bridge hit from the air too late is still a bridge that has already changed the battle. Sabotage and demolition offer another revealing angle. The destruction of bridges before the enemy arrives is one of the oldest and most rational acts in defensive warfare. If the attacker must cross, deny him ready-made routes. If he must build, force him into the open and make him pay. German officers and engineers understood this perfectly. They destroyed where they could. They prepared demolitions. They tried to turn rivers into deliberate obstacles rather than mere map features. But here too the Americans imposed a bitter truth. Destroying an existing bridge no longer guaranteed the kind of pause it once might have, because American engineers brought the means to improvise replacements, put up pontoons, establish ferries, and restore usable crossing capacity far faster than many defenders expected. In other words, demolition still mattered, but not with the old authority. That is part of why the phrase "impossible to stop" needs careful handling. It was not a claim that defensive methods had become useless. It was a claim that their strategic leverage had diminished. The Germans could still blow spans, hit crossings, and exact a price. What they could not reliably do was turn those acts into a long enough interruption to restore control over the wider situation. This same logic appeared in local counterattacks against bridgeheads. On paper, The remedy is obvious. If the enemy gets across, but only lightly, hit him before he thickens the far bank. Throw him back into the water before his crossing matures. This is classic operational common sense. A shallow bridgehead is vulnerable. Its first units are exposed, uncertain of support, limited in heavy weapons, and dependent on the crossing remaining alive behind them. If ever there is a moment to attack with fury, this should be it. Yet against the Americans, the timing was often already running away. The first wave over the river was seldom the true danger by itself. The true danger lay in how fast the Americans could turn that first wave into something denser and more stable. Infantry crossed, then support weapons, then more engineers, then anti-tank measures, then communications, then artillery links strengthened, then traffic increased. Then the bridgehead that should have remained thin began to gain weight. A German local counterattack that might have worked an hour earlier now ran into a position already less fragile than it appeared from a distance. This is one of the most haunting features of American river operations from the German perspective. The crossing often seemed to grow inside the defender's own decision cycle. By the time the Germans fully identified the shape of the problem, asked for the right support, and committed to a response, the bridgehead had already moved from possibility to fact. Not everywhere. Not always, but often enough to create that repeated tone of frustration in German observation and memory. It felt as though the Americans were shortening the useful life of opportunity itself. This has a direct connection to the earlier point about systems. Because the Americans did not treat the bridge as a singular triumph, they could keep thickening success after the first dramatic moment. The German defender might think in terms of breaking the crossing. The Americans were already thinking in terms of how quickly the crossing could become ordinary traffic. Once that happened, the river ceased to be a crisis and became a road. A road under fire is dangerous. A road that exists is still a road. Now place this in the actual late-war German condition. This is essential. The German army of 1944 and 1945 still contained pockets of skill, fierce local professionalism, and commanders capable of clear tactical understanding, but they were operating under cumulative strain. Fuel shortages hurt movement, communications suffered, air cover was unreliable, artillery resources were not what they had once been. Many units were under strength, tired, improvised, or forced to defend too much ground with too little depth. When such an army meets an American crossing force that can repair, replace, and reinforce rapidly, the equation becomes vicious. The Germans might know exactly what had to be done. They simply could not do enough of it quickly enough for long enough to reverse the operational effect. That is why so much of this story is really about diminishing returns. Hit the bridge. Sometimes you buy minutes. Kill engineers. Terrible, but others continue. Damage the approaches. Traffic slows, then resumes. Counterattack the far bank. Perhaps you dent the foothold, but more support is already coming. Destroy an existing bridge before the Americans reach it. They improvise another crossing. What the defender keeps losing is not the ability to inflict pain. It is the ability to translate pain into decisive pause. And that is what professional soldiers mean when they start using words like impossible in a serious way. They do not mean the enemy has become supernatural. They mean the enemy has become too difficult to interrupt at the point where interruption used to matter most. This dynamic becomes even clearer when you think about repairs. Repairs are unglamorous, but in this story they are among the central characters. A damaged bridge in battle is not simply an object waiting for peacetime maintenance. It is a site of renewed urgency. Men rush back under threat. Sections are replaced. Anchors are checked. Ramps are reset. Traffic is re-regulated. Damage is assessed, not for abstract engineering perfection, but for immediate usefulness. Can light traffic pass? Can support still move? Can a temporary solution hold until a fuller one is restored? American skill at turning damaged crossings back into functioning ones helped create the German sense of futility. The defenders were not only being asked to damage the bridge once. They were being asked to keep the bridge damaged long enough to matter. That is far harder. A single hit may feel dramatic, But if the attacker can restore utility before the delay carries larger consequences, the defender has spent effort without buying much strategic relief. This is one reason the Americans increasingly seem to be fighting with time as a weapon. They were not simply building, they were compressing the period during which defenders could still alter the meaning of the event. Every repair, every rerouted flow, every substitute crossing method, every truck that arrived when it should, every engineer who knew the next task without needing a speech, all of this shortened the window in which German defensive action could still be decisive. Think back to how rivers had once functioned in military imagination. They were pauses. They were tests. They were places where advancing armies might finally be forced to stop behaving as though movement could solve everything. But once the Americans demonstrated again and again that even damaged crossings could be restored fast enough to sustain momentum, the river changed character. It was still a place of blood and danger. It was still fought over fiercely, but it no longer guaranteed meaningful pause. That must have felt almost obscene to German officers formed in a culture that had long respected terrain and timing so deeply. The bridge, then, was not merely withstanding attack. It was surviving within a larger process that reduced the defender's leverage. This is why examples from the late war often carry the same emotional flavor, even when the exact details differ. The Germans observe the crossing. They hit it. They damage something real. Yet still the American movement on the far bank grows. More men appear, more weapons appear, more traffic begins. The crossing becomes usable, then busy, then almost normal by the standards of war. The defender is left with the maddening awareness that his resistance was not irrelevant, but not relevant enough. That phrase captures the whole tragedy from the German perspective. Not irrelevant, but not enough. It is also why one must resist the temptation to tell this story as pure triumphalism. The Americans paid dearly in many crossings. Engineers died in large numbers in the European War because they worked where danger was concentrated and necessary. Boats were wrecked. Men were shot off floats, shredded on banks, and buried in mud beside rivers whose names most viewers would struggle to place on a map. Nothing about this was effortless. The point is not that American power erased sacrifice. The point is that American power made sacrifice operationally productive, with a consistency the Germans found increasingly hard to counter. That is a very different thing. War respects not merely bravery, but the structures that keep bravery from being wasted. German officers could recognize that, and in a way that recognition only sharpened the bitterness. There is something almost easier about facing an enemy whose success seems accidental or theatrical. An enemy whose success grows from disciplined depth is more disturbing because it suggests repetition. If he can do it here, he can do it again. If he repairs fast enough under this fire, what happens at the next river? If he gets armor across this bank, what line behind it will remain stable? If the crossing already functions despite local damage, what hope remains of using terrain to rebuild strategic time? That repeated question haunted the late war. What line would truly hold if even the river had become temporary? A final layer must be added here. The bridge was rarely the only thing the Germans needed to worry about once it began to work. This matters enormously. Defensive systems fail not only when a single obstacle is breached, but when the breach begins dragging all surrounding problems with it. A functioning American crossing meant more than traffic over water. It meant wider artillery support forward. It meant deeper bridgehead organization. It meant armor sooner. It meant supply to keep pressure alive. It meant communications and command links strengthening on the far side. In effect, every minute the bridge survived increased the number of related problems the Germans had to solve simultaneously. And that is how collapse often begins in war. Not as one clean break, but as the multiplication of unsolved demands. Stop the bridge, stop the roads behind it, stop the artillery supporting it, stop the infantry holding the far bank, stop the engineers repairing damage, stop the next wave before it becomes too heavy. Stop the command structure coordinating all of this. Stop it with shrinking fuel, shrinking guns, unreliable air cover, and front lines already stressed elsewhere. it becomes too much. Not in the theatrical sense, but in the professional sense. Too many connected tasks requiring more sharpness than the defender still possesses. The Americans were not simply using bridges to cross rivers. They were using them to multiply the number of impossible choices facing the Germans. That is why local countermeasures so often felt like swatting at consequences instead of reversing causes. The defender could still hurt what he saw, but what he saw was only the visible front edge of a much larger operational transformation already underway. German officers did not need to speak in modern systems language to know this. They felt it in after-action reports, failed timings, missed opportunities, and the grim knowledge that what should have been a decisive interruption had turned into one more expensive delay. They felt it in the repeated pattern of attacking the crossing and then watching the bridgehead deepen anyway. They felt it in the shift from confidence that damage would suffice to fear that damage had become merely routine friction for an enemy built to carry friction. That is the real meaning of the title's claim. The Americans were not unstoppable because no one could harm them. They were unstoppable because harm no longer translated into stoppage with sufficient force. Their bridges were not magical. Their engineers were not bulletproof. Their convoys were not invisible. Their sights were not immune to artillery. What changed was the relationship between injury and interruption. The Germans could hit the bridge. They could not stop what the bridge had already set in motion. And once that realization took hold, every new river became heavier than the one before, because it no longer looked like an obstacle that might save time. It looked like another place where time would be lost. By the time many German officers used words like impossible to describe American bridge building, they were not making a technical statement. They were making a judgment about time. This matters, because if we misunderstand that word, we miss the real force of the title. The Americans were not crossing rivers by magic. Their bridges could be shelled. Their engineers could be killed. Their approaches could be cratered. Their ferry points could be targeted. Their partly built spans could be wrecked. Nothing about river crossing in the European War became easy. Water still had to be measured. Banks still had to be secured. Men still had to work in the open. Currents still pulled at equipment. Shellfire still tore bodies apart in places where there was nowhere dignified to die. German officers knew all of that. They had seen too much to indulge in myth. So when they said American bridge building felt impossible to stop, what they meant was colder, more professional, and in some ways more frightening than myth. They meant that the damage no longer arrived early enough or lasted long enough to change the outcome that mattered. That is the verdict this whole story has been moving toward. A bridge is only useful because of what it allows. It allows men to cross, then support weapons, then anti-tank defenses, then communications, then artillery coordination, then vehicles, then the thick flow of supply and pressure that turns a crossing from a daring action into an accomplished fact. The defender's dream is to break the bridge before that transformation happens. The defender's nightmare is to damage it after the transformation is already underway, when success becomes only a delay and delay becomes only another cost the attacker can afford. That was increasingly the German experience. The Americans reached the river with engineer skill, yes, but also with roads behind them, trucks behind them, depots behind them, standard equipment behind them, trained sequence behind them, command expectation behind them, and an industrial state behind all of it. That was the real bridge. The visible span over water was simply the part men could point at. The deeper crossing was taking place through systems, through traffic control, through material margin, through repeated procedure. Through the hard American belief that mobility could be organized, not merely hoped for. And because of that, the old German promise embedded in the river began to fail. A river had once been a pause, then a test, then a chance. Then, by the later war, more and more, often against the Americans, it became a phase. That word phase is not dramatic enough for what it means in battle. A phase is something you expect to complete. It may be dangerous, it may be costly, but it is not, in your planning mind, an existential gamble. That is the real revolution hidden inside this story. The Americans had become so good at integrating engineering, logistics, traffic discipline, support fires, and forward momentum that they increasingly treated one of war's most dangerous physical transitions as part of an ongoing movement they assumed would continue. German officers could feel the difference immediately. A crossing carried out as a gamble looks fragile. A crossing carried out as a phase looks stubborn. Even under shell fire, it gives off a different kind of confidence. Men still crouch when rounds land. Drivers still curse mud and wreckage. Engineers still work under impossible strain. But the whole operation radiates a larger message. This is not the one narrow moment where everything depends on perfection. This is the next hard thing, and we have come prepared to do it. That kind of confidence is devastating to the defender. Because the defender, meanwhile, is trying to do the opposite. He is trying to restore singular importance to the crossing. He is trying to make this the place where the enemy's larger motion is finally forced to stop, or at least to pause long enough that the rest of the front can breathe. But if the attacker turns the crossing into a phase instead of a gamble, the defender's entire emotional and operational hope begins to collapse. He may still hit the bridge. He may still burn vehicles. He may still kill engineers and punish every meter of water. Yet beneath all that, the larger motion survives. And that is what impossible meant. Not impossible to damage. Impossible to make damage decisive. This distinction becomes clearer if we ask a simple question. What does a defender really need from a river? He needs time. Not abstract time. Useful time. Enough time to move reserves, rework lines, shift artillery, evacuate supply dumps, repair communications, prepare counterattacks, or withdraw in some kind of order instead of panic. A few minutes can matter at the tactical level. An hour can matter operationally. Half a day can save formations. A day can alter a campaign. The river is valuable because it promises to give some of that time back to the defender by concentrating the attacker into a punishable shape. German officers increasingly discovered that American bridge building had made time brutally expensive. You could spend artillery, ammunition, engineer effort, infantry lives, local reserves, scarce movement, and command attention and still buy only a sliver of delay. Sometimes the sliver mattered. Often it did not matter enough. That was the horror. The economic exchange of defense was turning against them. They were spending more to buy less. War often comes down to exchanges like that. How much fuel for how many kilometers? How many shells for how many minutes? How many men for how much ground? How much destruction for how much interruption? At the river, the Germans were finding that the American answer to interruption was not denial of reality. It was absorption. Shells came in, men died, sections were damaged, traffic stuttered. Repairs began. New material arrived. The bridge resumed use. The far bank thickened. The attack continued. The exchange had changed. Damage remained real, but its consequence had shrunk. That is why so many later reflections from German professionals carry a tone not merely of anger, but of exhausted respect. They were not describing a theatrical enemy. They were describing a system that had learned how to carry friction without surrendering motion. And friction is the true sovereign of war. Everything in battle creates friction. Mud, bad maps, fear, delayed orders, broken radios, traffic jams, misread timings, lost units, damaged roads, shell fire, engines that fail. Men who misunderstand in the dark. The art of war is not removing friction. No army ever has. The art is deciding whose friction becomes fatal first. German officers had spent years believing, often correctly, that rivers intensified the attacker's friction more than the defenders. Against the Americans, that balance shifted. The crossing still created friction, but the Americans were better equipped to survive it than the Germans were to exploit it. So the old obstacle remained, but the old reward for defending it did not. This is the reason American bridge building deserves to be understood as more than an engineering story. Engineers are central to it, and they deserve every bit of attention they receive. Men standing in cold water under fire, locking sections together while artillery searches for the bank, belong among the essential workers of victory. But the reason German officers found them so difficult to stop was not the personal courage of the engineer alone. Courage alone dies at rivers all the time. The crucial difference was that American courage was plugged into an operating system. That phrase may sound modern, but the reality is old. Men become far more dangerous when their bravery is not isolated. Give a brave engineer enough standardized equipment, enough transport, enough trained partners, enough clear procedure, enough artillery support, enough traffic control, enough replacement material, enough command confidence, and enough national industry behind the line, and he becomes part of something much more powerful than heroism. He becomes a node in a machine that keeps converting effort into movement. German officers understood this in their bones because they had once lived close to their own version of operational transformation. They knew what it felt like when one military system forced another to confront not merely local defeat, but a new tempo of war. That is part of why the American crossings stung so deeply. They were not only losing ground, they were being forced to acknowledge a new kind of difficulty, an enemy who could make even vulnerable moments productive at scale. This returns us to the title's emotional center. Why did German officers say American bridge building was impossible to stop? Because what they were seeing at the river was not just a bridge. It was the point where American military power changed form. Factory output became sections and pontoons. Driver discipline became arrival timing. Training became speed of assembly. Artillery coordination became suppressed opposition. Traffic regulation became continuous flow. Repair capacity became resilience. National wealth became operational time. And then, at the waterline, all those things fused into one visible act. The bridge was where American abundance acquired shape. The Germans could shoot the shape. They could not undo the abundance fast enough. That is the simplest, honest answer. And it explains why so many traditional defensive habits began to feel less reliable as the war closed. Blow the bridge, and another crossing method appears. Damage the site, and the engineers repair faster than expected. Hit the far bank and more support crosses anyway. Delay the movement, and the Americans consume the delay rather than submit to it. Every familiar action remains tactically sensible. What changes is the scale of reward. The defender is still behaving like a competent defender. The battlefield has simply become governed by a different ratio of effort to effect. That ratio is everything in war. Armies do not collapse only because men are killed or tanks destroyed. They collapse when the ratio turns against them so consistently that no local success restores the wider pattern. That was increasingly the German condition facing American crossings in the final campaigns. A good hit no longer promised enough. A demolished bridge no longer guaranteed a meaningful pause. A bloodied site no longer guaranteed a failed crossing. The river could still kill. It could no longer be trusted to save. That is an extraordinarily bleak thing for a defender to learn. Think of the moral weight inside that realization. You are a German officer in the later war. Perhaps you still believe, or half believe, that the line can be held somewhere, if only enough time can be bought. Perhaps you no longer believe that, but you still cling to terrain, because terrain is one of the few remaining assets not yet exhausted. A river should mean something. It should give you leverage. It should let discipline and timing punish a stronger enemy. It should return some value for your suffering. Instead, you watch American engineers arrive, fight, die, repair, and continue until what should have been a temporary opening becomes a functioning route for the whole army behind them. At that point, you are not simply losing a crossing. You are losing faith in the obstacle itself. This psychological dimension should not be underestimated. Armies fight partly on material and partly on expectation. If a river still feels like a true opportunity to damage the enemy's timetable, men defend it with a certain inner conviction. If experience teaches that the river will only delay the enemy briefly before he restores movement, the character of the defense changes. Resistance may remain fierce, but it grows more tragic than confident. It becomes punishment rather than prevention. That, too, is contained in the word impossible. Not certainty of defeat, perhaps, but erosion of belief that the chosen method of resistance can still decide enough. And yet we should be careful not to end in abstraction alone. There is a danger in talking about systems and tempo and industrial conversion until the men vanish. The reason this subject carries force is that it remained, in the end, intensely human. American bridge building depended on exhausted drivers arriving on time, engineers lifting sections with numb hands, officers keeping control when control wanted to dissolve, artillerymen firing to protect men they could not see clearly, mechanics keeping vehicles alive in conditions designed to break them, signal personnel making orders survive noise, and labor done by thousands of soldiers whose names most histories do not keep. German officers feared these crossings partly because they could see the courage involved and realize it was supported instead of squandered. That is one of war's hardest truths to face. The enemy is not merely brave. He is bravely connected. He is not merely determined. He is determined inside a system that rewards determination with consequence. That is what made the bridges feel impossible to stop. Not because the Americans had discovered a structure that could not be broken, but because they had built a method in which broken structures no longer meant broken momentum. Once you see that clearly, the whole story rearranges itself. The riverbank scene from the opening is no longer just a piece of battlefield drama. It is the moment one military culture sees another solve a problem at scale. The hidden German officer behind rubble and sandbags is not only witnessing a bridge being assembled, he is witnessing the collapse of an old, comforting relationship between damage and delay. Every shell that lands without stopping the crossing teaches the same lesson. Every repair completed before the pause becomes decisive teaches the same lesson. Every additional truck that reaches the bank, every new section pushed into place, every support weapon that crosses before the defender can seal the bridgehead, every moment in which the crossing grows instead of breaking, teaches the same lesson. The Americans are not asking permission from the river anymore. They are organizing their way through it. That was the final meaning of impossible. Not a bridge the Germans could not hit. A process they could not derail soon enough. And in war, soon enough is everything. Because if the bridge exists long enough to carry real weight, if the far bank receives enough men to hold, if the guns and fuel and command traffic begin to move, if the crossing stops being a crisis and starts becoming a route, then the argument is over. The defender may still shell the water, may still burn the approaches, may still kill men whose work he fears and hates. But, strategically, the answer has already taken shape in steel, pontoons, planks, engines, orders, and exhausted hands. The crossing has become a road. And once American bridge building turned rivers into roads faster than the Germans could turn roads back into wreckage, the phrase, impossible to stop, ceased to be exaggeration. It became, from the German side, a professional confession. The old rules had not vanished. They had simply been overtaken by a stronger system, moving faster than destruction could matter.